Welcome back to In Conversation. This is a new series that I'm doing featuring different writers that I have conversations with about a certain topic. And of course, because this is a conversation, you can get involved at any time in the comments. And today we're talking all about the experience of being a diaspora writer. And I'm here with June Hur, who I will let introduce herself now.
Hi, my name is June, and I'm the author of The Silence of Bones, which is coming out on April 21st, 2020. And it's set in Chosun Dynasty, Korea, so 1800s Korea. And it's about an indentured servant named Seo who must assist a young inspector in solving the murder of a noblewoman. But there's more to the case than meets the eye.
Wonderful. It's such a perfect pitch. You're probably very used to doing your pitch by now.
Just
And I'm going to link all that information will be linked below.
Okay.
Also, in case people are interested, which hopefully they are, you should add her book to Goodreads. So we're going to talk about being a diaspora writer. And so I thought I would define that very quickly for everyone so that you can know what the hell we're talking about here. Mm-hmm. So diaspora as a term is really for the movement of any people away from their place of origin to different parts of the world. It's become used, I guess I would say, more colloquially as writers that are talking about, that are writing about cultural experiences that are their culture, but they may not have necessarily grown up in the place where that culture is from. And then they have a mix of culture from their home or origin country where a lot of their family or ancestors are from, and then they also have the culture from where they grew up and where they're living currently. Is there anything to add to that?
No, that was a great definition.
Perfect. Okay. Can you provide an introduction, a little bit of your cultural background and history?
Yeah, sure. So I was born in South Korea. And that's where my parents and my ancestors were all from. And then when I was a baby, I don't know how old I was, but my dad wanted to go study in the States. So all of us, well, it was just my mom, my dad, and I, we moved to the States, and we lived in Michigan for a few years. And that's where my sister was born. And then we moved to Canada when I was just a few years old still, maybe 5 or 6. And then I lived in Canada until I was in high school. And that's when and my brother was born too. I forgot him. My brother was born in Canada. But anyways, in high school, we all relocated back to Korea. And I went into the Korean public school system. So it was all Korean there. All the tests were in Korean. I had to speak Korean. And then after high school, I failed so miserably in the Korean high school. I had to come back to Canada, retake high school, and then I went to university here, and I've been living here ever since, and my siblings as well. My parents decided to stay in Korea, though, because they teach there. So I'm South Korean. And yeah, I would say I'm 1.5 gen. So basically the first gen is people who lived and were raised there, and then second gen are Koreans who identify more with the Western culture, more as a Canadian or an American. But I'm in the middle, where I identify strongly with very Korean values, but I feel at home in Canada in a way, because I don't know Korean as well as English. So I'm right in the middle, I find myself.
Yeah, because that's an interesting experience, because you were born there and then you went back.
Yeah.
Which is also very different too.
Exactly.
I was going to say, how was that experience besides failing high school?
Oh my gosh. So I remember when I was because of writing, I survived. Basically school would begin at around 8 a.m. and end at 10 p.m. because we'd be kept after school to self-study. So all the students would have to study from 5 until 10. And that's when I would just write. And even during classes, I would write because I had no idea what the teacher was talking about. I only did well in English because it was in English. but I never got perfect because the questions on the test were in Korean. So I'd be like, what is it? But yeah, other than that, like I learned so much about like my roots, and like one of my favorite memories of school and like friendships built in school were from the Korean school system, because you're stuck with your friends like from morning until night.
Yeah,
So we
if
were
you have
so
kids for
close.
that long, like
Exactly. Yeah, so we were like basically family. So yeah.
yeah, which is such an interesting experience.
Mhm.
And I didn't know any of that about you, so now I know a bunch of stuff.
I know.
Yeah, it's always kind of an interesting experience because sometimes people that are like diaspora writers
Hmm.
don't really go
Yeah.
technically to
Yeah.
like the country where their culture is from. I've only been so my family is from Trinidad and
Mhm.
Tobago. I always say Trinidad. It's Trinidad and Tobago as a country.
Okay.
We're from the Trinidad section, so I always just say Trinidad, which is probably bad. But anyway, but my family are from there. So my grandparents are on my both, well, not just my mom's side. Yeah, they're
Mhm.
both from there. And so they came, they had my mom, they came, well, they had her in Canada. So she was born in Winnipeg. So my mom was first, is that first or second? Second generation.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so then I was born in Canada. So then I'm third generation. I've actually only been to Trinidad once when I
Yeah.
was 5, but it was very traumatic because the family I stayed with didn't like us.
No. Oh, that's so
So
tough.
then I haven't been back
Yeah.
since,
Oh.
but because in Canada my family
Mhm.
participates like so heavily in the culture, like all of the food, and we
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
Caravana, which is like the Caribbean festival in Toronto all the time. So
Mhm.
I'm very involved in the culture, but I've only gone the one time. And so I have like very vague memories.
Yeah. That's really interesting.
But
Mhm.
it's a really interesting experience that you've gone during a time when you could like more clearly remember. Because when you're little, I'm like, how much
No idea.
do you remember? And there's all the nuances of like being part of a culture that you miss when you're a little kid that
Mhm.
you can notice more when you're a teenager and an adult.
Yeah.
So that's really interesting.
That
I'm
is
sure I'll go back at some point during my adulthood.
better experience, maybe. I hope.
Yeah, I think I would just not stay with family, and that would solve a lot of problems. Except for one side of the family, because
Okay.
like
Keep
there's one side and the other side, and one
yeah,
side was not good and one side
yeah.
was good. So I just stay.
The other side.
Yeah, visit the other side every once in a while, but not
Mhm.
stay with them. How do you approach writing about your cultural experiences, like in terms of like research and how you get inspired to write stories
Yeah.
from that perspective?
So, like I mentioned, I'm 1.5 gen, and so and like you said, like when your community has has strong roots in a certain culture, you end up like it ends up becoming a part of you, even whether or not you visit your homeland often or not.
Mhm.
And so I grew up in a very Korean community, and then I went to Korea, and I was able to like experience the Korean culture like in an immersive way.
Mhm.
And so it was a really interesting experience, because I actually avoided writing a Korean historical for most of my life, because I just didn't think Korea's past was relevant to me. But
Mhm.
then when I was researching to write about my book, I realized like it was like there were moments when I felt like I was looking at a mirror and seeing myself in Korea's history. And that's when it really hit me that like I had no idea, but a lot of what I believe in and what I value takes root in Korea's past.
Mhm.
And so researching about the Korean experience and just overall Korea's past helped me realize like more about myself. And so when I was writing, I felt like I could be myself more, because I
Mhm.
used to write British historicals before, and I felt like I was like restraining myself, and I feel like I'd write something, I'd be like, oh, but I don't think people in the Victorian era like felt and thought this way. But
Yeah.
with Korean history, like I felt like I could just express more of more of the things I believed in, like things like filial piety. It's such a strong like element to Korean history, but also to our present.
Mhm.
Um, and so I did research, a lot of research, But another part of it was just realizing like I have that lived experience, and that in itself played a big role in capturing the Korean experience and the culture. Um, but yeah, like the research was really difficult because there are a lot of resources out there, but when it comes to very niche details, it's very difficult to find an English like scholarly article on it. For example, for my second book, it's set in Jeju Island, and
which you went to.
yeah, I went there. Yeah, but the interesting thing is, Jeju Island right now is considered the Hawaii of Korea. But in the past, it was considered the island for like political convicts. And so it's even more difficult to find out like, how people lived back then, because there wasn't as much documentation. And so that's when like storytelling becomes very important, because my dad grew up in Jeju, and so I could ask him, what was it like living there? What did you eat? How did you spend your time? And then from there, I just kind of make educational guesses of like, oh, maybe people like, 200, 300 years ago, maybe they did something similar. Like they needed to collect wood like my dad. And so they went there and to this other place, and maybe like they ate the same food, and, so on. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Family members can like suddenly become this gigantic
exactly.
when you suddenly want to know stuff about.
How can you please talk to me?
Yeah, because then you're like, I actually don't know this, and I can't find it on the internet.
Yeah.
And you're like, right, I have family members that have grown up this way.
Yeah.
And I've never thought to ask them about stuff, but then suddenly they become like this really big resource. Like mine is set, I can't do historical because I can't research that much. But mine is an urban family set in Toronto with a Canadian family that have Trinidad roots and culture and all of that. And I have a scene of her ancestor, and her ancestor is a slave, and she's working in a sugarcane field. And I'm writing a scene where the sugarcane is burning, and I realize I have no idea what that smells like. And I like looked over at my grandma, and I said, she was visiting at the time, and I said, what does rotting sugarcane smell like? And she was like, oh yeah, it smells like sour vinegar. She just like knew right off the bat.
Oh.
And I was like, okay. And she's like, and then she came out like unprompted and said, they used to like burn the sugarcane to get rid of like pests and insects and stuff like that. And I was like, that's a really cool detail that I didn't even know. And now I know that. And now I've started trying to like piece together a bit more family history to see, what else I could be incorporating. And now it's like the family member, the aunt that just sent me memes on Facebook all the time. Now I'm like, hey, do you know anything?
Can you tell me about your past?
Because my mom is like, this is the relative that knows everything. And I was like, oh, all she does is send me memes. And then I finally asked her, and she told all of this stuff.
Wow.
I would have never known. Like, I think on average, a lot of people don't think to ask their family about their history until it becomes salient and necessary for you.
I was actually thinking a lot about this, and like talking with other people with an immigrant background. And I don't know if you've experienced this as well, but I find that like growing up, not just my parents, but I've heard other people say their parents as well, like they don't really talk about their homeland. Like they don't just like randomly share like, oh, like when I was growing up, like this and this happened. So I actually grew up knowing almost nothing about what my parents' life in Korea was like, or like how, just Korea in general is like, they never told me about Korea's history or anything like that. And so I think starting from there was like that disconnect, like, because they didn't tell me about it. So I never felt like actually connected to it, even though I was to the community. And I've heard other people share similar stories, and I just thought that was like really interesting.
Yeah, mine is the same, because I decided to do like a family tree and try and like gather up some more of this history.
Mm-hmm.
And my mom like has no idea what my grandparents' names are. Like my great grandparents on my grandpa's side, we have no idea what their
Yeah.
names are. I don't know what he did in Trinidad growing up. All I know is he had like 10 siblings.
Yeah.
And
I
they
think
like,
I only know that too. They had
and they like all almost left.
Yeah.
Like pretty much all of them have left Trinidad, but he never like sits down and like tells stories. But there'll be things where I learned about later. So like he had this plastic spider, my grandpa, and he used to chase me with it.
Yeah.
Like, and he called it Linlu, but he also talked about Anansi, and I didn't think anything of it. And then later I learned that there's this whole like Caribbean folklore about Anansi spider and like stuff like that, where later on I realized that it was a cultural thing, but
it clicked.
I had no idea. And he never really says anything unless he's like worked up and passionate about something.
Yeah.
Like when he randomly told us that our family originated from a tribe in Africa that was called Sambury in Kenya.
Oh,
and
that sounds
like,
interesting.
yeah. And that was all. He never elaborated. And at the time, I was just like, okay, cool. But now I'm like, oh my gosh, I gotta go find him and I gotta piece together this, because like slaves came from the west side of Africa and Kenya's in the east. And so now I'm like, what happened?
Oh wow, that sounds like a fascinating story to track down.
Yeah, so I have to figure that out from him. But it's true, he never just said stories about Trinidad. My grandma doesn't do that after. It just kind of felt like everybody's just not talking about it.
I don't know what it is about like crossing over to another country that just, for not everyone, but I'm sure, but like for a lot of us, it just disconnects the stories. And like and we end up like growing up thinking we're like this lone island unconnected to like another country. But then I think as we grow older, we realize like it's like almost like a mystery we're solving. Like everything starts connecting, and like, oh, like I see roots connecting to this other land I've rarely been to, but like, you know, you're more connected than you think, kind of thing.
Absolutely. And I think it's really common, like what you were talking about earlier, where you're a writer and you don't write about your own culture for a while because it feels kind of disconnected. And like for me, in some ways, it was I wasn't sure that I was qualified, but I don't know who would have made me qualified. I just wasn't sure, even though you're living day in and day out, you know, you're connecting to your culture in different ways. Like for us, it was always food. My grandpa all the time, and my grandma, my maternal grandma cooks sometimes, and that was kind of the big connection. But then again, there was this weird issue where I didn't really write about being Trinidadian at all, because it seemed kind of odd to do it, and just wrote stories about like Canada.
Yeah, I just wrote about Britain. Victorian era, era.
We are technically a British colony, so
exactly
close enough. So what advice would you give to diaspora writers?
One of, like, to just give background context, in Korean, the word for diaspora is kyopo, and historically it has a very negative connotation because it just means a Korean who doesn't live in Korea and who has lost their Korean roots. And so for me, my advice is consider writing about your culture like you're reclaiming ownership over it. And like you said, it's like when we're writing about our culture, we're learning about it. There's so much I learned myself about Korean history. I actually knew almost nothing about Korean history except what, you know, I'd briefly hear in school when I was awake in Korea. And what I'd see on TV, that was basically the entire sum of my knowledge. But I learned so much, and like I mentioned, like I felt like I was able to understand myself better, and so I feel like I was able to reclaim the culture in that way by studying the history. So, you know, take ownership by learning, by discovering, by examining the, you know, even the pros and cons of your culture, and understanding it better. And so I feel like my advice is instead of focusing so much on the terror, because there will be terror and there will be, I hope not, but there often will be people who will, question your right to write about your homeland and your culture. So instead of focusing on that, I think it's so important to feel empowered, and to consider writing, like I said, as an act of taking ownership of a place where maybe for so long you felt disconnected from, and a place you felt like you didn't belong to. And so that's what I personally learned through my own experience. And that is my advice to other diaspora writers.
Yeah, I think that's perfect advice.
Yeah.
Perfect advice. I would say all of that. That's awesome. And yeah, really, like you said, taking ownership and also giving yourself permission to write it. So if you're in a state, if you're in a state where you're like, I don't know if I can write it, because it's your culture, it belongs to you in some way, and you have the right to take ownership of that and to explore that, because you will learn a lot about yourself and it's really worthwhile. And I think there are a lot of things that you can get out of writing that experience that you may not necessarily writing outside of it. It's a different sort of experience doing both. Yeah. So that's all I would say. Thank you so much for joining me, June. And where can people find you on social media?
So you can follow me on writer June Hur on Twitter, or June H Writes on Instagram. And I'd love to talk more about the diaspora writer experience. And if you're a diaspora writer yourself, I'd love to connect and chat more about it and learn more about what you're working on.
Perfect. And I'm going to link that all below. And June's great. She, like, on her Instagram will post like when you go on trips to Korea, you'll post about stuff like that. You have like quotes and stuff from your book and all sorts of information. On Twitter, you're always sharing new information about your book and the history. So follow her on Instagram and Twitter, and also pre-order her book. It's coming out in April, and at least add it to Goodreads, get the Goodreads count up. Yeah. And yeah, thank you so much for watching this episode of In Conversation with June. Thank you so much, June, for joining me. And of course, if you want to join the conversation, feel free to comment with your experiences of being a diaspora writer, comment with any questions you have, and I'm happy to go through those and answer as best as I can. And if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. Please subscribe to my channel if you aren't already. Besides this wonderful series, I also post writing advice, publishing tips, querying tips, all of that, along with writing vlogs, etc. And thank you so much for watching. Bye.